So I just wanted to thank you all for joining this call today. We're really excited to be sharing our research from the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. We've just put out our product impact framework paper and would love to get your comments and your feedback on that, as well as share some of our research with you. We also have Rob Zochowski joining us today, who is the program director of the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. So I'll hand it over to Rob in case he has any few words that he would want to add.
I will be brief. Katie is the expert on this topic. Thank you all for joining us. As Katie said, I'm the director for the Impact Weighted Accounts, as well as a number of other faculty research projects at Harvard relating to impact investing and sustainability. One thing I'll just note is this paper we chose was put out, I think you got the pre-reading, it was put out as a working paper, and we chose that media of dissemination very specifically because a working paper at Harvard is very much meant to indicate that it is still work in progress. It's meant to put out some ideas for comment and feedback. And we very much view the GSG, and we're so grateful for Francesca and the partnership, as a key way of tapping into knowledge globally. And so we're really grateful for you all joining us so that you can give us some feedback. But I wanted to stress that because we really do want this to be a collaborative effort. Our team is small, and so we are, our sort of path forward has been to work consulting with experts where needed, of course, but to put out sort of a minimum viable product. Hopefully this is not a minimum in sorts, but I use the parlance that's used by a lot of startups for reactions. And so this is the one of those attempts at that. So Katie, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And then also, so just for a little context on that, we're still having our open discussion period right now for the working paper, and we would really love any of your feedback or any of your comments either on this call, and we'd also be happy to get that by email as well. So the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, as Francesca had mentioned, is an initiative that aims to drive the creation of financial accounts that reflect financial, social, and environmental performance. This is an initiative that is incubated at Harvard Business School under the leadership of Professor Serafim. And the purpose of monetizing these impacts is, first of all, we believe that putting these into monetary units makes it a very intuitive measurement unit. Secondly, monetization allows for comparability and aggregation of impacts. And finally, it enables the use of existing assessment tools. The research that we've been done has been divided into 3 pillars. The first is employment, which is really looking at the impacts that organizations have on their employees. The second is environment, which is looking at the impact of organizations' operations on the environment. And lastly, we have the product pillar, which looks at the impact on society and on the environment from product usage. So what we've done is, over the course of our research, we've noticed that for product impacts, they tend to be very idiosyncratic across different companies, across different products, across different organizations, and that there is a need for a standardized methodology of measurement that would enable transparency and comparability of product impacts. So with this, we've pulled together a product impact framework that we believe captures the commonalities across different industries and across different companies. And on the left-hand side of this framework, you'll see in blue that we have the 2 dimensions of reach. So this is how many individuals is being reached by the product, as well as how long can this product be used for. So we thought, if you have the reach of a product, we conducted a couple additional thought experiments to try to identify other dimensions of product impact. So from reach, we got that thinking about, if you have products that have the exact same qualities, the exact same features, they work the exact same way, then the product that has larger reach would have larger impact, whether that's positive or negative. So once you control for reach, we started varying different characteristics of products. And the first one that we looked at was the actual pricing of a product. So if you have a generic drug and a prescription drug, the prescription drug is more expensive than the generic, but they essentially should both work in the same way. So the product that is cheaper has more inherent impact, which leads us to identifying accessibility of a product as the first dimension of customer usage. And this is how affordable the product is, as well as how available it is for underserved markets. So now that we've identified access as the first dimension of customer usage, we started thinking about some other dimensions. So if you hold reach constant and you hold access constant, this is kind of a silly example, but it really helped us think through it. If you compare water and a designer handbag, and somehow they have the same reach and the same access, one would say that water has higher impact than the handbag would. And this is really because water is a basic need, whereas a designer handbag is not. So under quality, we're really capturing the inherent goodness or whether or not the product fulfills a basic need, as well as its effectiveness at fulfilling whatever its purpose may be, and then any health and safety issues that accompany the product. And finally, the last dimension of customer usage that we have is optionality. So here we're holding reach constant, access constant, and quality constant. And what we thought of was tobacco. So tobacco has very extensive reach. It's very affordable. Its quality is what the consumer would expect it to be, and yet it is viewed as a clear bad. So here we're capturing that clear bad of tobacco under optionality, which looks at an individual or a consumer's ability to choose a product with full choice. So in the case of tobacco, the product is addictive, and therefore the consumer does not have full freedom of choice. In some other cases, you might be operating in a monopoly, or there might be some information failures, and in that case, that would also be captured under optionality. And then the last two dimensions of the framework that we have are focused on the environmental impacts from products in terms of their usage. So this is any pollutants and any emissions that are released in usage of the product, as well as the end-of-life recyclability of the product. So how the end-of-life treatment is of the product once its usage has been completed. So we'll take a pause here in case there's any questions or comments thus far on the product impact framework itself.
Hello, it's Olivia from the UK. I just wanted to understand where the treatment of people in the supply chain of the product is dealt with in the framework.
Definitely. So the treatment of individuals who are in the supply chain of the product will be dealt with on the employment pillar. So the employment pillar looks at any operational impacts that are occurring on the employees, whereas the product pillar is looking post-sale or once the product's actually in usage.
Okay, but what about where people aren't employees? They're contractors as part of supplier organizations. They're in the supply chain, but they're not employees.
Yep, that should also be captured under the employment pillar. It's broader than just the direct employees themselves, but anything that's tied to the supply chain should not be captured in the product impact framework, which is really focused on post-sale impacts.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Hi, this is Samir from Brazil. I'm trying to, how would that apply to social enterprises that are more on this, that work more with services than products?
Yep.
And I have a few examples here if that would make it easier, but I don't want to.
Yeah, definitely. So on the side of services and social enterprises, I think when we think about companies like that, we really hope that they're more disruptors in the market. So we might see them score lower on something like reach, but the expectation would be that they would have much higher scores in terms of their access and their quality dimensions. And similarly, for a service that is not really a clear, tangible product, we would still hope that you could identify the quantity of individuals that the service is reaching, how affordable that service is. The quality of the service would be measured by the effectiveness of that service in and of itself. And likely there would be minimal environmental usage and end-of-life impacts.
I've got a question
Yeah.
from the UK. So from the perspective of companies that might ultimately use this framework and they're thinking about trying to meet their impact objectives, I suppose, how do we position, so on the paper we talk about SDGs under quality, how do we position impact in this context as sort of the end of their theory of change and trying to position what they're trying to achieve with their products from the perspective of their overall impact as a business. So I understand how it works in terms of, adding up the sort of algebra of product impact, but in terms of framing this as a tool to demonstrate your ability as a business to be impact led, maybe it's just a matter of positioning. You're putting the quality at the beginning rather than the reach or something. Have you thought that through, or what sort of reflections on that?
Yep. So that actually might be a good transition to our next slide, which really looks at how we're hoping companies and investors might use this framework. So we believe that the monetary impacts that are estimated can really be used for impact-weighted financial statement analysis. And the hope is that not only would these monetary figures help these companies with identifying how they're doing in terms of impact, it would actually make a difference in terms of how they're functioning in their industry itself. There's one example that we'll dive into a bit deeper when we get to consumer packaged goods products. But for effectiveness for a CPG company, we're really looking at what the nutritional value is of their products. And one of the industry trends that you might notice there is that we're hoping from this framework, you'd be able to capture food reformulation trends, which happens to be a very specific example, but I think it highlights that the effectiveness of the product under quality will really hopefully capture impacts of the product itself, but also interesting trends that these companies are starting to move towards. And then I'll flip to the previous slide in case there's still additional questions on that. And I can also continue moving forward, and we can save some of these questions for the end if that's helpful.
Keen to come back to it.
Go ahead, Katie. I think you've got some good examples that will help kind of illustrate this point a bit better for everyone. So yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So before we dive into the detailed examples of how we've calculated some of the impacts across these dimensions, we really quickly wanted to walk you through an illustrative, simplified example that shows how we go from the product impact framework to monetized impact, and then what that really means for the actual insights that you're able to generate. So on the left-hand column, we have the product impact framework, which has quantity, duration, access, and so on and so forth. We then move to the next column, which looks at public company data. So this is data that companies themselves are publicly disclosing. So for example, we have the number of customers, we have how long the product can be used for, the price of the product, customer satisfaction, the number of marketing incidents, and the emissions from usage and end-of-life treatment. And these are just some very simplified example numbers. And then we take these public company data points and we marry them with industry assumptions. So for example, under access, we have the average product price. Under quality, we have the average customer satisfaction. Under optionality, we have the fine amount that is associated with the marketing incident, as well as how much of sales of the product had occurred with that incident. And then we know the cost of carbon on the social side. So then we take the public company data and the industry assumptions, and we use those to estimate a monetized impact value. So for example, with access, that's simply the difference between the product price and the average product price over all the customers that have been reached. Whereas the quality piece looks at the difference in customer satisfaction and ties that back to the product price and the number of customers reached as well. And again, these are really simplified examples, and there's more nuances to these estimates that we'll dive into once we're going through a couple example dimensions. But the hope is that there'd be insights that could be generated from these monetary values. So for example, a company that scores really high on access and on quality, but is still working at expanding its quantity, we would hope that that would help us identify potential disruptors of the market. We'd also expect that under quality, if you're looking, as I said earlier, if you're looking at some industry specific effectiveness trends, you might be able to identify things like food reformulation efforts, improvements in driver assisted technology when we get to automobile manufacturers. And if you look at all of these as a whole, you'd be able to identify how these companies are really positioning themselves for future impact potential. So we've selected a couple product framework dimensions that we think are particularly interesting to dive into. The first is on pharmaceuticals, and you'll see at the top that we're looking at access and the underserved dimension of the pharmaceutical industry. So this is a sample company, and they have 13 products on the World Health Organization's list of pre-qualified medicines. So what we've done is we've identified one of the products in there, and we've looked at whether or not that product addresses a sustainable development goal. And since it does qualify for monetary impact under the underserved component. So for example, if you have a terrible product that does not address a sustainable development goal, and you're selling it in these underserved markets, you obviously wouldn't get underserved credit here. So what we do is we know that this product does address a sustainable development goal, and we're looking at family planning implants. So we get the estimated number of implants that have been sold by this company to an underserved market through their procurement deals. And then we look at the estimated healthcare cost savings per person from having these implants available to them, and we multiply that out to come up with the underserved access impact. The next example that we'll look at is water utilities, and the dimension that we're looking at here is quality. Specifically, we're looking at the basic need component of quality. So this is a company that provides services to 14 million people. And we know that water is a basic need because its elasticity is less than 1. For some other industries, we have other methods of determining whether or not a product is a basic need, such as identifying whether or not it's a staple or the actual geography that the company is operating in. But in this case, we're able to just rely on the elasticity of the product. So we also have from the World Health Organization, the global economic loss from lack of water access, as well as the affected population that doesn't have access to water. So we use those two numbers to come up with a loss per person from sanitation issues and from dehydration, which is around $300 a person. And we multiply that by the services that have been provided to those 14 million people to come up with the basic need impact for a water utility. And here we have the packaged foods example that we were referencing earlier. So this is looking at a packaged foods company, and it's looking at their quality under the effectiveness component, specifically how they are creating impacts with trans fat. So we have the total sales in the US from this product, from this company, and we know that they only have 90% of products that have trans fat, that have no trans fat, meaning they still have 10% products that potentially do have trans fat. So we take the 10% of products that do still have trans fat and we multiply that by the total US sales to figure out how much of their sales still has trans fat in it. We then divide that by the average price per ounce, and we multiply that by the amount of trans fat per ounce to know that this company has sold about 3.3 billion grams of trans fat. We then divide that by the annual trans fat consumption, where the trans fat consumption is 2% of your caloric intake, to come up with around 2 million people being impacted by these trans fat sales. We then multiply that by the prevalence of coronary heart disease in the US, which is at 5-ish%, and we multiply that by the associated increase in risk for coronary heart disease from consuming 2% of your calories from trans fat, which is 23%, to come up with the increased risk for developing coronary heart disease from this trans fat consumption. And finally, we multiply that by the medical and the productivity costs associated with coronary heart disease to come up with a negative trans fat impact that's associated with this company. And then finally, for our last example, we're looking at automobile manufacturers. And here we really wanted to show that it's possible to compare two different companies within the same industry, and that you can see how the numbers might look a little different based on how the companies themselves are actually performing. So this is looking at the environmental usage of an automobile. And what we have here is two sample companies, Company A and Company B. And just for context, these are two real companies, and the data is from their publicly available company disclosures. So we have their tailpipe emissions in grams per mile, and they're pretty different. Company A has this at 312 and Company B has this at around 251. And what we do is we multiply the grams per miles by the average miles driven to come up with the annual emissions from car A and from car B, which comes out to 4.2 million grams and 3.38 million grams. And then we take that and we divide that by grams per tons to come up with how many tons of emissions were emitted by car A and car B. Finally, we multiply that by the social cost of carbon and the number of vehicles sold to come up with our emissions impact. And a couple things to note here, the social cost of carbon is applied with no discounting over time, and that these mileage and social cost of carbon numbers are industry assumptions that we expect will be refined as new information is available and as research is ongoing.